Very much, and that concludes question time. I will now move to the next item of business, which is Stage 3 proceedings on the Welfare Reform Further Provision Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, the marshalled list, the groupings. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds. Thereafter, I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division. After a debate, all other divisions will be 30 seconds. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible after I call the group. Members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. Right. Okay. To which we now come. So, if everyone's in place, I'll call Amendment 1 in the name of Drew Smith, grouped with Amendment 2. Mr Smith, to move Amendment 1 and speak to both amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The purpose of Amendments 1 and 2 is to ensure a more appropriate level of scrutiny of the regulations which will emanate from this welfare reform bill. The effect of both of these amendments, if passed, would be to change the requirement from a negative to an affirmative procedure. The issue of negative or affirmative procedure for subordinate legislation is not normally a matter which excites the interests of many members of this Parliament, far less those outside it. However, it is something which has been discussed at some length by the Welfare Reform Committee and debated previously at Stage 2. My reason for bringing these amendments back at Stage 3 is that there remains substantial support among stakeholders for a greater degree of scrutiny of the regulations than that which the Cabinet Secretary is proposing. The bill we will debate this afternoon is an enabling one, and regulations arising from this legislation will form the main substance of the interaction between welfare reform and links to passported benefits. As a former member of the Subordinate Legislation Committee, I understand that there are 3 types of procedure broadly understood as negative, affirmative and super affirmative. And I will trust that members across the Chamber understand the differences rather than seek to lecture those more experienced than myself. Suffice to say that moving from a negative to an affirmative procedure would mean that regulations would be subject to a vote in Parliament rather than not. Stakeholders who have made representations to the committee and who have lobbied in support of Amendments 1 and 2 are concerned that the regulations are right as well as timely. The timescales for both negative and affirmative procedure are the same at 40 days. Indeed, many of the charities and others who are supporting these amendments would have initially preferred a super-affirmative procedure to guarantee maximum scrutiny and the widest possible consideration. Yet they have come to accept affirmative as a compromise because they are as concerned as the Cabinet Secretary is about ensuring that the tight timescales which the Scottish Government must work to are adhered to. I agree with them for this reason, and also because I was concerned that a super-affirmative procedure would not provide Scottish ministers with all of the flexibility that they might need. The timetable is essential to ensure the continued provision of passported benefits when the UK welfare reform changes come into force. It is also necessary that consideration is concluded before the new financial year. Presiding Officer, the traditional approach to welfare reform, which focuses on a framework in primary legislation accompanied by multiple regulation-making powers, can undermine parliamentary scrutiny. Those are not my words, but those of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, which published a critical report of the UK Welfare Reform Bill, and which should serve as a warning against the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government repeating the same mistakes. The Cabinet Secretary indicated at Stage 1 that she would seek views over the summer on regulations, and I and others welcomed that at that time and do so again today, noting that she has published a consultation on this subject. I would be grateful if she could, in responding to the points I have made so far, indicate if she has now ruled out consulting on draft regulations in favour of just asking open-ended questions. Presiding Officer, if there is a will to work together on the issue of procedure, then I am sure a way can be found to make an affirmative procedure work, so that the debate can then move on to matters of greater political principle, and I therefore move Amendment 1.
Many thanks. I now call Margaret Burgess.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In their Stage 1 report on the Welfare Reform Further Provisions Scotland Bill, the Welfare Reform Committee referred to the evidence which they had considered as unrelentingly depressing. As we come to the conclusion of Parliament's consideration, we start to look towards the future, and in the words of SCVO, we begin to think about moving from process to principle. In the 3 debates we have had on this subject in this session so far, beginning first with the issue of the LCM and then consideration of the Scottish Government's legislative proposals. Labour and SNP members have been largely united in our opposition to many aspects of the reforms to our welfare state which the coalition government has embarked upon. At each stage, however, we have been at pains to point out that elements of the changes could have been an opportunity to make the welfare system fairer rather than simply to make it more draconian. People across the United Kingdom and here in Scotland do want to see a system of benefits which ensures that support is provided to those who need it when they are unable to work or unable to find work. At the heart of our welfare state should be a contributory principle which makes clear our duties to pay in when and if we can, in order that we receive assistance when it is needed. Too much of the changes seem to be solely based on a desire to bring down the benefit bill, rather than seeking the right balance between support which is affordable and therefore support which is there when any one of us need it. In the Stage 1 debate, I quoted from Ian Galloway of the Church of Scotland Church and Society Council, who said at the General Assembly this year, "If austerity means we all have to tighten our belts, and maybe especially those who can most afford it, then so be it. But what is really happening is that the most vulnerable are being punished out of all proportion." That concern, which has been highlighted by groups representing disabled people, social landlords, children's charities and many others, was one of the major influences on Scottish Labour when we argued that the LCM and welfare reform should not be nodded through and that distinct Scottish legislation should be brought forward if it was required. The resulting bill is, of course, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, enabling legislation, concerned with putting in place a framework for how regulations will be brought forward, which connect both devolved and reserved benefits. So-called passported benefits are rightly at the heart of this. Capability Scotland, for example, points to the blue badge parking permits, bus passes, leisure cards and even energy assistance programmes. Eligibility for each is assessed through receipt of a UK welfare benefit. However, the truth is that the impact of welfare reform, even at this stage, could be so large that even now we still do not know the true extent of the problems, but also the opportunities it may create for the Scottish Government, local councils and others. The Welfare Reform Committee has suggested that some £2.5 billion could be taken out of the pockets of some of poorer people in Scotland. In Glasgow, which the Cabinet Secretary and I represent, as well as many other areas, that will also be money taken from shop tills and from social housing providers. Now, Presiding Officer, Labour supported the general principles of this bill at Stage 1. Through Stage 2 and our amendments today, we have sought to improve it by advocating the concerns of those most closely concerned with the delivery of services and the representation of those groups most affected. It has been a good process and there has been engagement from the Government on the issues. And we have not sought to bring amendments which we didn't believe had the support of people in the sector. For example, there was concerns about the wide-ranging natures of regulatory powers that ministers were taking and that they were taking those powers without any kind of sunset clause. Now, and we decided not to bring forward amendments on that and other subjects where we could have perhaps found contention if that had been what we are looking for. Of course.
I thank the member for taking intervention. On the subject of the ministers taking powers to enable these bills to go through, would you not agree with me and others, many others, that the best way to propose this would be for the full powers of the benefit system to be to the Scottish Parliament, considering that we're looking at regional types of benefits, which the Tories are saying they're going to bring in. Actual Labour even proposed that as well. So would you not say we should have the full powers of the benefits to protect the vulnerable people, rather than mucking about with it?
I'm grateful to Sandra White for that intervention. Of course, the Prime Minister this week removed a reference to regional benefits from his speech, and it seems that the SNP are the primary proponents of regional benefits and indeed regional pay across Britain. Notwithstanding my disappointment, Notwithstanding my disappointment that the Cabinet Secretary did not accept my amendments earlier, I am grateful to her for the work we have done together to ensure that the choices which will be made are based on evidence, modelling and reporting of the impact, despite, as I said, the objection of SNP members of the committee at Stage 2. For the avoidance of doubt today, Presiding Officer, I should make clear that the Scottish Labour Party will be supporting the passage of this bill at decision time today. In an earlier debate, I said that we should remember that this will be a unique piece of legislation, and the Cabinet Secretary has outlined that that is her view too. It began life with a partial but unprecedented rejection of an LCM, which we on this side pushed for. It resulted in the establishment of a special committee, which was pushed for by the voluntary sector, and an engagement in the issues which has been wide-ranging and vital, despite the sense of urgency which hangs over us to get the legislation right and to get it in place quickly. The work of the Welfare Reform Committee, Presiding Officer, will no doubt go on, and in many respects the detail of what will happen next will have to happen over the summer and be considered when Parliament returns, and indeed the Cabinet Secretary indicated further consultation into the autumn. For their part, many of the charities with a close interest in this bill have already turned their attention towards implementation, and there has already been some debate about what this might mean, including in the pages of Third Force News. Labour considers that the receipt of universal credit or personal independent payments should become a passport to devolved. But I've obviously been listening to the psychologist too much and I can't say the word now either. But it should become a passport to devolved benefits. But we also believe that all of those who are currently eligible for a devolved benefit should remain so. Now, before closing, Presiding Officer, I just want to mention advice services once more. In the Stage 1 debate, I asked the Cabinet Secretary to consider the position of advice services and to right the wrong which the Scottish Government have been involved in by pocketing money for advice services, which arises from the UK welfare reform changes, and I pointed to the example of the Welsh Assembly Government, who have invested considerably in their citizens' advice bureaus to help them cope with the huge increase in demand which welfare reform will no doubt create. There will be difficult choices ahead in this process, but the test, in my view and in the view of Labour, is whether those choices are made fairly and not arbitrarily. This bill is not one which either the Government or the Opposition would wish to be necessary, but necessary it is, and when passed it will mark the beginning of a new phase of considerations where we should look for opportunities to improve what we do, rather than just shore up our own parts of the system in the face of cuts coming from elsewhere. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call on Alex Jones.